Hello, this is Robert Rickover at Body Learning, and today my guest is Richard Brennan, an Alexander Technique teacher in Galway, Ireland. Richard has been teaching for about 20 years, and he is also the director of a training course for Alexander Technique teachers in Ireland. He is also a very prolific writer. He's written numerous books on the technique. He's been featured in many magazines and journals, and particularly relevant to our conversation today, he has a new book on posture called Change Your Posture, Change Your Life, which is due for publication in early 2012. And we've had an earlier conversation about the Alexander Technique and posture in general. And in this conversation, we're going to address the topic of children's posture. Richard, welcome to the show.
Okay, thanks, Robert.
Richard, could you start by giving our listeners a short definition or description of the Alexander Technique?
Yeah, the Alexander Technique is about finding out what you do to cause numerous problems like neck problems, back problems, or even if you just want to perform something like golf or a sport or dance, if you want to perform it better, the Alexander Technique can help you use your body in a different way.
And in a more effective and easier way, and that certainly relates to posture, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah. And children's posture is a kind of an interesting topic. We usually, traditionally, would assume that the children, once they get up and moving around, age 4, 5, and 6 in there, we would hope that they would have good posture. They haven't been worn down by the stresses of life and so on. And I think often they do. But you may have observed, I'm sure, and I think a lot of us have observed that certainly within a few years of that, you often see some pretty harmful postural sets with children. How would you explain that, and what is your take on that?
Okay. This is a very important topic, and I have been lobbying governments, both the UK and Ireland, to get things changing because maybe I was only teaching for 5 years and I heard this radio program. It was a headmaster that says, when our kids come into school at the age of 5, they have lovely posture, they are bright-eyed, they're eager to learn, eager to please, but when they leave school at 16 or 17, their posture is atrocious, they have no life in them at all, and they don't want to learn and they don't want to please. What in the name of education are we doing to our children? And I just thought that really struck a bell. Mm-hmm. Well, what they're doing in schools is they're putting all children at the age of 5, and they're seated. I don't know what it's like in the Canada or the US, but all the school chairs in Ireland and the UK, they must slope backwards by at least 4 or 5 degrees. The reason they slope backwards is to make the chairs stackable, but people don't realize that children are sitting on 2 rounded bones called the sit bones, which is part of the pelvis. When you put a rounded bone on a chair that slopes backwards, the whole pelvis and hip joint become out of commission. So the children have no chance except to bend their backs as they're working at the desk. The first thing the child does is it tips the chair onto the front 2 legs. Nearly all children do that. The second thing they try is to put a foot underneath. They actually sit on their foot, and that helps their posture. But both of these habits are actually, they get told off for them. So in the end of the day, they sit on these backward sloping chairs, they bend every single bone in their spine, and we wonder why at the end of the day they come out completely bent.
Yeah, it is exactly the same situation here. Maybe even worse, because here what you often get, the stackability issue is key, right? You want to make it easier on the custodial staff of the school at a tremendous cost to the children. But here, often it's not just a badly designed chair from the child's point of view, but it is a chair desk combination that is a one size fit all arrangement that you can't do any of that tipping that you just talked about because it's a whole unit, and it's taking kids who've been used to running around freely, moving a lot, and telling them to sit still for many hours a day, and to sit still in an extraordinarily environment that makes it difficult not to mess up your posture, I guess is the way I would describe it. And
Yeah,
so it is the same situation here. And the other factor, I don't know in Ireland whether this has sort of come into the news, but for the last 5 or 10 years here, there's been a lot of discussion about the effects of carrying heavy backpacks full of books. Often the backpacks will weigh, 20, 30 pounds or more, and these would be, first or second, third grade kids carrying them to and from schools. And again, that presents a real challenge to a child of that age to pull that off without creating some distortions in their posture and coordination. I don't know whether that's the case in Ireland or not as well.
Yeah, I mean, I have a picture right in front of me of a child carrying a school books, and it is distorting the spine, maybe 30 degrees, and it just sets up kids to actually have scoliosis. It's actually 15,000 hours at school, plus a load of hours spent at their desk at home, which they're actually sitting in these completely contorted postures. I mean, I feel pretty angry about it, the whole thing. I had a person come in a couple of hours ago for a lesson, and she was 12 years old. She came in and she looked literally 4 inches shorter than me, and when she went out, she was actually taller than me. Mm-hmm. I asked her just to write something as she would at school, and the contortion of her shoulders and neck was completely unbelievable, and yet it felt perfectly normal to her.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's so ironic in America anyway. We have very strict laws about workplace environment, and there's a lot of ergonomic jargon kicking around for workplaces. But the kind of furniture that children, small children, 6 years old, are forced to put up with would not be allowed in a workplace. I mean, the company could be sued for poor ergonomic design, and yet we somehow think that children, well, they're resilient, I guess. I don't know what the thinking is. We've got to save money because we have a lot of chairs. We've got to move them around a lot because it's a classroom that needs a lot of adjustment, and we're going to the design is all going to be focused on that, and the health of the person using the chair is very, very far down the line. And like you, I'm pretty angry about it too. I have seen the kind of chairs and furniture in schools here that my kids have gone through, and even to the extent that you'd think maybe lunchtime could be a little break from that, but no, you don't even get to sit in a regular chair at a table anymore. You have a table with 6 bolted kind of like stools attached to it, totally unmovable. Again, one size fits all. It just seems as though the priorities are completely wrong in that area. So, given all of that, Richard, what can we do about it?
Well, we can chip away at the teachers. My son actually went to, he's 19 now, but when he was 5, I came in to the classroom. This was a private school, a very small school, maybe 60 or 70 pupils in the school. And I said to the headmaster, he was an American guy and quite open. I said, "Do you mind if I put a wedge-shaped cushion on Kieran's chair?" And he said, "Well, why? Why would you want to do that?" And I explained to him, and he said, "This is very interesting." So he got all the teachers, we had a meeting, and then they decided to actually buy a cushion for every child in the school. And 2 years later, he came up to me and he said, "There is a noticeable change in the children's posture." And this is even without any Alexander lesson.
Hmm.
This is just changing the furniture. And I did the same for my daughter, who is now 11. I went into school to give a talk on the Alexander technique out of a class of 24 8-year-olds. 8 of them are wearing orthotics because of posture problems at the age of 8.
Hmm.
I asked the children how many of them were getting either headaches or neck aches at the end of the day, and half of the children put their hand up. These are 8-year-olds who are setting themselves up for poor posture. Anyway, just introducing the cushion and just putting the cushion on the chair, which actually levels the chair out, most children at the age of 8 change their posture immediately when they start writing at their desk. So on my website, I actually sell chairs and wedge-shaped cushions because it's the only thing that I think outside giving a child or an adult Alexander lesson, which is actually going to improve their posture. But also, I've noticed that if I don't actually introduce the wedge-shaped cushion, people keep coming back for lessons because they're sitting on these terrible chairs, and all the good work that I do in the Alexander technique gets undone because they go and sit on terrible posture, terrible chairs. Now, the chairs aren't the be all and end of it, but it's much easier to get lasting improvement if they're not going back to the very thing that caused the tension in the first place.
Right. But I think I agree with that. And I would think also, just before we move on a little, another fairly inexpensive addition would be making stools of various heights available to kids to sit on. Have you ever
Hmm.
experimented with that? I mean, there is a certain advantage in sitting with your knees lower than your hips, and some simple wooden stools as options. And I wouldn't want to force anyone to sit on them, but that can certainly for adults. That can make a huge difference, and I have to say I haven't experimented with that with children, but I would think it would for them as well.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I mean, height adjustment, so you can, adjust the height as they grow. And the other thing is desks. I mean, I don't know about you, Robert, but when I was at school, all the school desks sloped forward, and now they're all flat. So all the kids have to bend a little bit further forward.
Right,
And that's the other thing that I would suggest is even just getting their book that they're reading at and making it prop at an angle towards them, or even
right.
their exercise book, if you can prop it forward in some way, therefore they don't have to bend so far forward at their desk. So there's quite a lot you can do.
So there are things that can be done along those lines, and also in terms of backpacks, maybe thinking through whether it's such a good idea to have kids carrying extremely heavy weights around all the time, especially young children. But I think we have to also talk about another factor here, which is that children do pick up postural habits from those people around them, and they pick them up most noticeably from the people who are around them a lot. So even before they get to school, it could be their parents or their caregivers. Um, and so some of the responsibility I think we have to assign to those people. What kind of suggestions would you make if you see I mean, I'm sure you've had examples of parents who've called you about their children's posture that doesn't look good to the parent. The parent comes in with a child, and you just take one look at the parent, and you can pretty much see where the child got some of that from. How do you deal with that?
Well, I had one really interesting case because I had an 8-year-old child who was walking in a very strange way. She was walking with her right foot going out and her left foot going in, and it kind of makes her walk sideways, and it twisted the whole pelvis round. And the parents had gone everywhere to try and get help. And then I noticed the father was walking with his foot going out, and the mother was walking pigeon-toed. So the child had caught one habit from each of the parents. I do actually point it out, and I would recommend the children, if they're in the environment of school, do get some Alexander lessons, but also that the parents have a few themselves as well, to actually stop the children, imitating them, because children, as you quite rightly said, are imitators. That's how they actually learn. So if you want to look after your children's posture, the first thing to do is actually check your own posture out to make sure you're not doing something you don't realize and the children are copying.
And I would say, as an Alexander teacher, that process of asking the parent to look at themselves, it has to be done pretty delicately and diplomatically. Parents can be pretty easily offended if you say the wrong thing to them. I don't know whether you've had that experience or not, but it's not. I mean, you make it sound nice and logical and easy, and in some ways it is very logical, but I think it does require a bit of diplomacy on the part of the Alexander teacher to deal with that. And,
what I do find is if the parent stays in the room and sees their child transform, which children usually do because the habits aren't quite set.
Very quickly, yes.
Very quickly. Then the parents actually look at and I do involve the parents. I maybe help the child to release one shoulder and leave the other shoulder up, and then show the parents. Quite often, the parents themselves get really interested and just have Alexander lessons. They book them for themselves, or they say something like, "Do you think I could do with some of that?" And I won't point out actual postural problems that the person has, because, yes, you have to be diplomatic about it. But I always say, would you like to, try one session and maybe even give a discount for the parent? And once they've tried it once and it is an experience, as you know, they usually book another 2 or 3, and that way gently get them involved.
It sounds like you might be a little more diplomatic than I've been at times in the past. It's interesting, this whole business of children picking up habits, postural habits from the people around them. F.M. Alexander, who is the guy who was sort of the developer of the Alexander technique, writes about this in one of his books. I can't remember which one now, but he talks about, he's in England, I'm guessing he's writing this in the 20s maybe, and he talks about parents who hire, I guess not nursemaids, but I don't know, whatever, nannies, I guess. They'll hire a nanny to watch over their kid. And Alexander says, most people, when they go to find a nanny for their kid, they get the cheapest one available. And he said, they're not thinking about the effect that person's movement and posture patterns are going to have on this small child, 2, 3, 4-year-old child. Children of that age are incredible mimickers of people around them. And Alexander also made a point, which I think is very interesting, that small children, they don't just mimic people around them, they have a special facility for mimicking the worst, most bizarre patterns that they encounter. So if a nanny is doing some really weird way, has some really strange way of walking, or holding their head on top of their spine or whatever, the child is much more likely to imitate that. And all the economies of getting a cheap nanny go down the drain when you balance it against, the harm done to the child. So, Richard, before we come to an end, do you have for any parent listening to this, and maybe seeing what we're talking about, if they visited schools, they might visit a school with their eyes with a little different way of looking at things, hopefully after they listen to this. Do you have any other suggestions for a parent who is concerned about their child's posture?
Well, I think nearly every parent is concerned about the posture of their child. Everyone I talk to can see the child getting more bent and more bent and more bent,
Hmm.
and they kind of know it's something to do with school and bending over school desks, but I don't think they realize that they can do something about it.
Hmm.
And even just adjusting the chair with a cushion or getting a height adjuster like you suggested, there are things that you can actually do. And if they did get involved in the Alexander technique for their children or for themselves, I think that's the best thing they could actually possibly do, because everything, even if the child ends up with terrible posture at the age of 18, there is something that can be done about it, that they shouldn't just give up, and everything is reversible.
And that I would add to that, picking up on something you said earlier, small children, young children, if they can be motivated to be interested in bringing about changes or learning how to change things, can change extraordinarily rapidly compared to us old folks. I mean, a small child can make huge changes very quickly and simply, whereas most adult students of the technique, it's going to be a number of lessons. There's going to be all kinds of issues to confront along the way. So if you can address the problem earlier, it's going to save everyone a lot of time and trouble.
Yeah, I think Alexander once said, "Give me a 5-year-old, and I can teach them my technique in 5 minutes."
Yes, I
But
believe that. I think that is, if you had a 5-year-old who was actually interested, you could teach a 5-year-old in 5 minutes everything they'd need to know. I
mhm,
actually believe that.
mhm.
Um, and I was had another thought, but it's left my mind. Anything you want to add before we bring this to a close?
No, all I can say is any listeners, I would definitely, um, check out the Alexander technique. It is a wonderful technique, and it can do wonders to improve your posture, no matter how old or how young you are.
Well, that sounds like a good place to end the conversation. My guest today has been Richard Brennan, who is an Alexander Technique teacher of some 20 years experience in Galway, Ireland. He is the director of an Alexander Technique training course there. He's a prolific writer uh, on the technique, and his new book coming out in early 2012 is called Change Your Posture, Change Your Life. And if anything that we have been talking about intrigues you and you want to learn more, if you live anywhere near Galway, Ireland, contact Richard. We'll put a link to his website there. And if you live anywhere else in the world, we'll put a link to a site where you can find a teacher in your area. Richard, thank you so much for being on the show today.
It's my pleasure, Robert.